Mahabharata respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sivasankaran, Guru Piranyo, fellow Jnanis. Today I want to continue with uh, going a little bit more deeper into the first principle of Mahan, which is the I. This is part 4. I hope all of you all are following this discussion. We have already covered the first 3. And today we're going to go deeper into the big I that Swamiji spoke about. So in the last class, the last lecture, we covered the small I and the big I, the distinction between small I and the big I that Mahan spoke about. In this, um, he characterizes this small I identity is our physical material identity. And this physical material identity has limited frequency. And given that nature has imprinted the biology in us. The biology has limited frequency, and for survival, nature has imprinted in us various tendency, including instinct, and one of the key survival mode is things such as fear, anger, hatred, jealousy. All these are part and parcel of nature's imprinting in us as part of our material biology. And over time, we see that as a species, our intellectual capability started stepping up, given that the nature around us became more and more challenging. To survive, we had to strategize, we had to think. So we saw an evolutionary leap in our mental capacity and capability. And over time, we were able to move from more like an animalistic quality to a more refined quality. And we saw that continuous development taking place. In spite of that, I think part of the limitedness is imprinted in all of us. And there are times that that's what makes us, lack that illumination because our frequency, at least the material identity's frequency is rather limited. And in the last, satsang, I spoke about how through the process of introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation, the limitedness can slowly evolve to a higher level of illumination and enlightenment until one attains that big I or the enlightened state of existence. And this state of existence, Swamiji calls this big I or the paripurnam or completeness. Or, one has that comprehensive understanding of and awareness of everything around them and within them. And as one becomes more and more refined in their intellectual and awareness, the frequency that has been very gross becomes more and more subtle. One is able to comprehend more subtle frequency, and ultimately one attains the peace and tranquility, the clarity and the creativity, and eventually they become more and more universal. So we looked at that very, very carefully in the last satsang. And we also saw this entire primordial atom, which imprinted, everything in this universe. As what Swamiji says, I is nothing but the potential energy inherent in every atom. This is what we call store energy or stored energy in the atom. So what is this big I? So we want to go a little bit more deeper into what this big I consists of. And Swamiji then talks about this big I is that which exists as all comprehensive entity. That means this substratum is very important in giving existence to everything that we know in this material universe. And it evolves into the various distinct things, from the weak forces to the basic building blocks of our universe, from atoms to molecules to more complex molecules, from hydrogen to helium to all those complex molecules to, forming, stars and galaxies and planets and complex beings such as us. So everything that exists in this material universe is because of this big I, this comprehensive entity. One can call this as the cosmic intelligence. There are many names people use for this, Some call it God, some call it cosmic intelligence, some call it nature. Whatever we call it, it is part and parcel of everything that exists in this material universe, both sentient and insentient entities. So let's go a little bit more deeper. What is this big eye made out of? Because there is an interesting passage that Swamiji says, Ni nan nane ni nium nanum nane nan. He says, you and I and you are the same. So what is the sameness that we see? All we see in our material world is diversity, differences, in planets, in forces, in people, in all the diverse species. And we see so much varieties. We see so much differences. Even among twins, when you have twins, you see that though they may look very similar, but there is something different about them, right? So again, we see that even, we see that everything in this universe has diversity. So where is that common feature that unifies everybody? And where is this thing, this element or this philosophy that Swami speaks about, that I and you are the same? What is the sameness? Because that sameness, if we understand the sameness, perhaps that's what gives us that universal identity that all of us are the same. All of us are one. There is no two. So we're going to explore this a little bit more in detail, and we're going to invoke, some of the teachings of Mahan, also some religious teachings that embed this knowledge, and a lot on the scientific knowledge. And we're going to bring all three together. So we see that it's quite interesting that as we go deeper, there is a very important scripture called Thirumandiram. You see, as Had Swami spoke about earlier in this, everything, manifests from this big eye. We see that in this Thirumandiram by Tirumular. Tirumular is a great saint, like Swamiji. When they ask him, what is this atom, this primordial atom, and what is in this atom? He says that Anuvul amainda peroliye. He says, Anuvul amainda peroliye. He says, that which exists in this atom is this light, this paranjodi, this illuminating, enlightening, substratum. And here it is, it is written in the Thirumandiram. The Lord is the beginning of all. He is the atom within the atom. So we're going to go deeper into what is this atom within the atom. And as we go right up to the end of what we know about the atom, and you're going to see something very interesting. So he says, divide an atom within the atom into parts 1,000 times. They who can thus divide, the atom within atom, he says that may well near the Lord. So when one comes to the end of that, you would be able to cognize that divinity. He says he indeed is the atom within the atom. It's quite interesting because when we go back to the, so this is in the Thirumandiram, written, by great scholars and great philosophers like, Tirumular. And you see very similar description of this atom, the most minutest thing that, at that time, these great philosophers thought about. Anu is atom. Anul amenda peroliye. So let's go back to, some of the scientific discoveries, of this atom. So we see that, why how does this evolution take place? And we see that this goes back to various, philosophers, the Hindu philosophers that talked about atoms. They talk about this, earth, fire, water, different elements of this universe around thousands of BCs, here they recorded 500 BC, but it's beyond that. And they talked about atoms round, having interesting features, and they gave features of fire, air, water, earth. And that evolved, and the Greek philosophers, they had this thing called the atom, and they call it indivisible. Indivisible means that which you cannot divide anymore, right? and they talked about the elements of this indivisibility. This is the last stop where you cannot split it any further. And of course, we know that the description is very gross in the understanding of what atom was, and that as our understanding of nature becomes better, as our introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation intensified, as our intellectual and mental lens became more and more sharper, our understanding of atom became more and more sharper. The most minutest building block of nature became more and more, sharper and more clearer. And then we went on to other descriptions. In the 1867, we had people like Lord Kelvin that proposed some kind of a understanding of this atom. And this evolution continued. And this was about the time in 1904 is about the time Mahan was born. 1900, Swamiji was born. And in 1930, Niels Bohr discovered or came up with a model of the atom, electrons, protons in the center, and so on. And I hope all of you all looked at the YouTube clip that I sent and the evolution of the atom, because the climax is very important, because the climax has very important meaning to our own spiritual being. And this progressed, this introspection, exploration of this atom intensified. And then we had people like Einstein and you know uh, uh, other great scholars that came on and started looking at much more deeper into that atom and into the nucleus. And as that evolved, we had better understanding of our own atomic structure, that atom is not the smallest component. We have within that nucleus electrons, protons, and this journey continued. And interestingly, all of them were peering within the most minutest thing in this universe, this expansive universe, knowing that if they discover what is within this minutest thing, the discovery or understanding of the grand universe would be very, very clear. So that continued, and the understanding of electrons, protons became very clear. And that journey went on further. As our instrumentation became better, our atom, they were able to decipher the atomic nucleus, protons, and they went even more deeper into electrons and quarks and strings and membranes. And I'll tell you why this is very important, because there is something that Swamiji discovered, through his own meditation, which is very, very parallel to some of these discoveries. You see, scientists use microscopes and telescopes to discover electron microscope, and more, refined instrumentation to go down, deep down, to the minutest block and discover atoms and protons and electrons and strings and quarks. And they also peer into the universe using telescope. But you'll see that Mahan actually realized that both what is micro and what is macro must be part and parcel of our own biology. So what he did was that instead of using electron microscope or telescope, he used something called the inner scope. The imprint of all this must be within us. And he started going deep within himself to be able to discover this vibration or this energy or this different manifestation of this big I that manifests as energy fields and more minute version of light and vibration and the cosmic intelligence. So as the scientist was exploring this, Mahan was doing his own research and intensifying. So we see that perhaps this is what both were coming to, the same common denominator, which is scientists was coming to strings and vibrations. Mahan was discovering unarvu, which he calls the kundalini. The kundam is the vessel, Lini is actually the vibration. So the Kundalini is what he was discovering, that cosmic vibration. So using the electron microscope and the telescope, scientists was arriving to the same vibration as Swamiji using that inner scope to come to that same vibration. Not surprising at all, because one was taking a objective search, looking at all the objects, the atoms, to go deep down. The other was taking a subjective exploration. After all, the subjective exploration is based on the subject that is experiencing this observed world. So both the objective search and the subjective search was converging at the minutest and the last building blocks of consciousness or existence. So as they were both going deeper down, scientists was discovering something called superstring theory, which is this vibration that was vibrating in the entire universe. And that same vibration, which is, as I mentioned, this inner vibration that has got higher order continuum, scientists call multidimensional space. Mahan calls it Irul, which is a higher order continuum beyond the state of this material existence, yet all the material existence unravel from it. So we see that both were converging to the same, path, like somewhat like, multiple rivers are all converging to the same ocean. And Mahan was discovering this unarvu within himself, he was experiencing it. Scientists was picking this up through the various instrumentation that they had. After all, they are also peering through their telescopes and microscopes, as how Swamiji was peering through his inner scope. The base vibration is still the same. So here are some examples of how that base vibration, what we see as flower, as we go deeper, it is atoms, carbon atoms. These carbon atoms made out of nucleus and electrons and protons and neutrons. As you break deeper and deeper, you see that all you have is that vibration, the cosmic vibration called strings, right? So the strings are a manifestation of these protons, neutrons, carbon, and the flower, right? So they vibrate in this cosmic vibration. In that same way, we see that our biological body, where our mind is anchored, all our thoughts, our experiences we obtain that through the reflection of this material existence. Everything that we see, we touch, we smell, we hear, everything manifests in the form of, electromagnetic, in the form of vibrations, and it has its frequency, and we form thoughts, we get experiences of this material world, and it all vibrates within ourselves. So we see that while matter body, we may be very different, we see that at the minutest, at the smallest building blocks, it is the same vibration, that the cosmic vibration that is manifesting within ourselves, within the flowers, and within everything in this entity. So we see that, as the flowers emanate from that string vibration, as the molecules, water, everything vibrates, and we are made out of the same stuff, we see that we also vibrate in that same vibration as everything else. And this is why we see that, when great saints and sages say that "Nie nan, nane ni, nium nanum nane nan," I and you are the same. Or they say that, the entire universe is within me and I am part of that universe, which means that though we may be separate, though we may be diverse in the object form, in that basic building block, we are all the same cosmic vibration. You see, and this is why in all teachings, including Mahan's teachings, including the philosophy of God, the discovery of God can only take place through an inner pilgrimage to understand the basic building blocks of our own existence. And this is why, it is not an external search, it is an internal search. It's how Mahan discovered, through this, inner scope, through this, meditational process, through this introspection, contemplation, reflection, and intensive tapas, as how scientists, intensively look through, peer through the electron microscope and the telescope. We should use our own inner scope to, look very, very deeply, as what Swami said, true noka noka, and we'll see that we'll transcend our material biology to the most subtlest, form of our existence, which is none other than the big I. And Swamiji, captures this beautifully in this, uh, you know, a quote. He says, "It is true. Without him, that God, nothing can move. Without that big I, nothing moves." Most people think I move, I do these things, and this is our material ego that does it. This is not really. Even the material ego is animated by this higher order existence. He says it is more true. Nothing can move without your thinking. So this is the second part that is really important. So if that God is imprinted in us, and if we think that we are the material identity, then our thinking and the power of our mind is limited, right? But if our thinking is anchored on that big I, we see that we realize that as how nothing moves because of the big I, the same thing, nothing perturbs us in this material world, and nothing can impact us in this material world, and nothing gives us direction in this material world but that I within all of us. And this is what this meditational method, this I God philosophy of Mahan teaches us, that the direction comes not from outside to inside, but from inside, that guides us, that gives us bearing, that gives us the spiritual compass, not only to live our lives, but also live our lives in a very universal way, always being connected. And this is what Swamiji says, that, Swamiji's meditation is Swamiji, is always connected to that big I, state. And while still in this material body, he is in that state of Paranjoti, the completeness, the wholesomeness. And though the body is limited, the mind that is inoculated by this big I is unlimited. Though the body is mortal, the mind that is anchored on this big I is immortal. Though the body is divisible, this mind that is anchored on the I is, indivisible. Though this body is finite, the mind that is anchored on this big I is infinite. And this is the lesson that Swamiji teaches us, that every day when we allocate time for that intensive introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation, what we are doing is we are folding our small I back into the big I, so that when we come back to the material identity, we are powered by the big I, right? We're not caught up by our material ego. We're not caught up by the material limitedness. We are powered by it. So though our body, mind, and biology may be limited, you see that our existence becomes unlimited, inspirational, blissful, and transcendental. And that's what the I God philosophy, and that's what Mahan's meditational method gives us. How do we fold back that small I into the big I, and recharge it and reinvigorate it and re-inspire it, and engage back the world with a much more, grander and universal mindset. This is what the teachings of Mahan's I God philosophy is. Sandosham.